Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. Our guest today is Scott Allen Ellsworth, an acclaimed American historian and New York Times bestselling author. A professor at the University of Michigan since 2007 and previously a historian at the Smithsonian Institution, Ellsworth has written influential narrative histories, including Death in a Promised Land, The Secret Game, and The Groundbreaking, the last of which was longlisted for the 2022 National Book Award. His latest work, Midnight on the Potomac, The Last Year of the Civil War, The Lincoln Assassination, and The Rebirth of America, explores the final turbulent months of the Civil War, the nationwide Confederate conspiracies surrounding John Wilkes Booth, and the complex emergence of a reborn nation in the wake of Abraham Lincoln's death. Praised by scholars and reviewers alike as both meticulously researched and vividly written, the book has already stirred fresh conversation about Lincoln and what it means to rebuild a nation amid division. Scott, welcome to the show.
Peter, I'm just thrilled to be on History Shorts. You have a terrific show, and I listen to it all the time.
Thank you so much. So let's start with you, Scott. What got you into history? Is there a pivotal moment in your life when you're like, I think I'm going to pursue this?
You know, I thought about that. I'm not sure if there's an easy answer. One answer is the fact that I was raised by the World War II generation. And so, my folks had both, they were old enough, they had survived the Depression. They were both in, my mom worked for the Army during the war. My dad was in the Army Air Corps. All of my uncles and one of my aunts were in the Army or in the Waves. Ditto for my Boy Scout leaders and, Little League coaches and stuff like that. So hearing stories of the past was something that was very much a part of my life early on. And I discovered history books fairly early, in grade school and just loved them. And it took a while. Once I grew up, I was the son and the brother of scientists, and it took a while to leave science. And but by the time I got to college, I realized that history was my thing. Absolutely.
Writing Midnight on the Potomac, what was the impetus for this story? And is there anything that surprised you the most while you were doing this research?
Yeah, so I think there were about three streams that led me to the story. The first was that I've been, a fan of the Civil War since I was, 6 or 7 years old. I'm growing up during the centennial of the war. I'm collecting the postage stamps. I'm watching TV programs and, reading books and stuff like that. And it's something that I followed throughout my life. Years later, I was a historian at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History for 10 years. And every day I would walk by, Civil War artifacts. And if you live in Washington, the Civil War is everywhere. So it's something I kept up with. The second thing, though, was that, I'm old enough to remember the late 60s as a teenager in junior high and high school and how divided we were as a nation. But we are much more divided right now, and I've never seen anything like it. And the only time that we've been as divided as a country was back in the 1850s and 1860s. So as I was searching for a new book, I found myself being drawn to the Civil War era. And then my agent a couple of years ago, when I was looking for a new book, suggested, why don't you look into true crime? I sort of did, and I had a couple of near hits with stories. Didn't quite find anything. And then I was thinking, well, what was the crime of the century? And I thought, well, what was the crime of the 19th century in the United States? And that clearly was the murder of Abraham Lincoln. And as I started to dig into that, I started to run into some things that didn't fit the sort of accepted view of things. And that's really where the book took off.
Perfect segue, because the topic you write about has been written about before, right? But you managed to bring a certain level of like freshness and relevance to this topic that I have not actually seen since reading Jay Winnick's April 1865, 25 years ago. What new perspectives or insights were you most excited about to uncover and share retelling this pivotal year?
Well, I think there were a couple things, but one of the biggest eureka moments was, discovering that the version of John Wilkes Booth that we were all taught, is wrong. So the version that I was taught, and you probably were too, in my case at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was that Booth was this sort of second-rate actor who was second-class actor living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother, both actors, kind of a loner, a loser, kind of an archetype for a John Hinckley or Lee Harvey Oswald. And the amazing thing, you know this, Peter, but the amazing thing about the Civil War, it's never been the sole property of academics. So there are all these amateur historians who do terrific work. And there was a gentleman by the name of Arthur F. Lew, deceased now, who spent his entire career working for an insurance company in Pennsylvania. But in the evenings and the weekends, for decades, he became obsessed with John Wilkes Booth. And in the pre-ancestry.com, pre-newspapers.com era, found basically every newspaper clipping about Booth, including reviews of all his plays. And he self-publishes, doesn't self-publish, but publishes a book called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day, which I bought off the internet. And as I read it, I realized, my God, Booth wasn't second rate. He was a superstar of the American stage. And that was sort of the first clue that maybe part of our story was wrong. And then I ran into some other work by these, dedicated amateurs who really looked into, questions of Booth's connections with the Confederate Secret Service. And once I sort of had that breakthrough, I realized we've got a bigger story here. And that really got me going. Frankly, it took about 2 years to figure it out. And the writing came fairly quickly, but realizing how close we came as a nation, sort of to losing our nation. And by that I don't mean that the Confederacy the stars and bars weren't gonna fly over Boston Common or something like that. But the question was whether the Confederacy was going to survive as an independent nation or whether slavery was going to continue. And we just barely made it, by the skin of our teeth.
Yeah, a few things to unpack here. One, kind of as a side note, you mentioned the idea of these amateur historians. You mentioned newspapers.com, you mentioned ancestry.com. I feel like as historians now, we are very lucky.
Absolutely, incredibly lucky. The amount of, in the Hathai Trust and all of those books and things like that. I had an ace in the hole, though. From my office window, I can hit with a baseball the second largest university library in the United States, the University of Michigan. And they have everything, or if they don't have it, they'll get it for you. And while I was writing the book, at any time, I probably had 100 books checked out. But, I found all of these obscure regimental histories and, memoirs of officers and soldiers. And and stuff that probably hadn't been checked out in 100 years, but they had it all. So I was very, very fortunate that I had all this material right handy.
Yeah, it's a lot of people don't realize that there is such a thing as having too much information. That makes it more
Right.
difficult sometimes, right?
It does, but I've been at it long enough now that I'm fairly, and this as a writer, but it's a craft, and you develop certain skills and you develop ways to go through a lot of material quickly. A couple of books ago, I made a rule that as I was reading, I wrote a book about mountaineering in the Himalayas in the 1930s, and I made a rule that here I'm reading these great stories. If I couldn't see what I was reading turning into at least a sentence on a page, I would move on. So you just really have to have a lot of discipline and just look for the stuff you're looking for.
Yeah, sometimes I'm like, oh, all this should be in my book. But I'm like, then I would just be rewriting the person's memoir in my book.
No, exactly. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to engage with the reader. You're trying to give them a story that they want. The goal is to keep them turning the pages and reading and just wanting to know what's going on. But you find ways to touch them and as a human being. You turn the characters into people with foibles just like the rest of us, trying to work our way through, the time we're living in.
You kind of delve into this Confederacy's secret operations throughout your book, right? Which is something that you never really hear about reading about this topic. And you talk about the attempts to burn New York City, kidnap Lincoln. How significant do you think these covert efforts are in prolonging the war?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, it's important to remember that even though most of them were not successful, they were honest, serious efforts. And for that matter, Booth is not a crackpot by any means. He's a rational figure. He's a white supremacist. He's a racist. He's pro-Southern. All of these things, but he's acting very rationally. I think it was not a bad strategy once the Confederates realized after the spring of 1864 that they could not win their independence on the battlefield because of attrition, that they realized we have to start a new kind of war. And so they launched this forgotten terror war against the civilian population of the North because they're trying to build the peace movement. They're trying to get people to say, let's just let the South go. Let's just be done with this. So I think it was a good strategy. Absolutely.
Your book manages to build tension through the narrative, which I think is a testament to your writing and your research, because obviously with history, we know how it ends, right? But as I'm reading your book, there is this uncertainty as I'm reading it. Like, is the Confederacy going to survive? Is it not? I guess the question is, why was the Union victory, in a sense of suppressing the Confederacy, not certain until the very end of the war?
Well, it was not certain for a few reasons. Once again, in the early spring 1864, everyone thought in the North there was great hope and great confidence that the war is going to end. The largest army ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere, which was the Army of the Potomac, they had 120,000 troops, seasoned troops. They're set up between Washington, D.C. and the Rapidan River in Northern Virginia. And Virginia is really where all the marbles are. Whoever wins there is going to win the war. And they're ready to go. And they've got this new commander in Ulysses S. Grant. But instead of, just marching straight to Richmond, ending the war before the leaves fall, they run into this horrible buzzsaw, in the wilderness and in Spotsylvania. Grant loses 35,000 troops, nearly a third of his army. And that's followed by more disasters. During the summer, a Confederate army gets away out of Union Eyes, marches down the Shenandoah Valley, and crosses the Potomac, invades Maryland, and in fact invaded the District of Columbia, and were within hours of burning the Capitol, burning the White House, all of that. And this is not only getting the peace movement to start to get going, let's let the South go in the North. But Lincoln's political career seems to be over by the end of the summer. Even he realizes, we're not going to get reelected. The dream is over. The war is going to end. So this was a very, very tense time. When we, it's easy for us to go back and look at things in history and think that they were preordained. They weren't. But the other thing is you have to live history through their eyes at that moment. And, and it was, boy, it could have gone either way. There's no question in my mind, at least up until the fall.
And it does come through your writing. We know how it ends, but yet I'm reading your book and I'm like, like what happens? I love
Well,
it.
that's great. Thriller writers know what they're doing, and you can learn a lot from them as well.
You draw connections between deep political divisions in 1860s and today. What lessons from the Civil War's final year and the aftermath can we apply to understanding and addressing the contemporary divisions in America?
Well, I think there's a couple ways we can do that. One way is that we all have to realize that the internet and all of these things and the algorithms, they're all designed to sort of to increase rage at the other people, and we've got to figure out a way that we can start to have meaningful political discussions across the political aisle, where we, respect people as individuals and try to understand why they think what they're thinking, try to explain why we think what we're thinking. I think that's number one. And in the South, right prior to the Civil War, freedom of speech ended. There were plenty of people who were unionists in the South, but they could not speak out against slavery. So we need to create, a new atmosphere where people can talk. The other thing, though, that, and as vital as Lincoln is, he's our greatest president. I don't know if we deserved him. I mean, he's just way up at the top. As important as Sherman is, as Grant, some of these other people, the reality is that our country was saved in 1864 and 1865 by a remarkable, unprecedented coalition of men and women, blacks and whites, free and unfree, native born and immigrant, who put their own personal, top issues aside, joined together and worked together. And they defeated the Confederacy. They destroyed slavery. They saved the Union, and they gave our country a new burst of freedom and a new opportunity to live up to our original goals. These are great American heroes, and I wanted to write about those people. I think we're in a cynical time right now, and we forget how many heroes that we really have, and these people are just right up there. And the reality is that the America that you grew up in and I grew up in and your listeners grew up in, we all stand on their shoulders. And they were able to save our country back then, and it's my hope that can encourage us to save it once again now.
I kind of was going to finish with that answer, but now
Sorry.
I'm kind of curious. No, that was good. I'm kind of
Yeah, sorry.
curious now. One of the greatest what ifs. What if Lincoln doesn't get shot? How does Reconstruction look different? Historians we're not in the what if business, but we're also fans of history. So maybe fans of history are in the what if business. What do you think? Any ideas? Have you ever thought of?
I don't have a clue. That was, one of the issues with writing this book is there's so much going on that there were a lot of things I had to not deal with. And certainly Reconstruction policy was one of them. Here's the deal. I'll tell you a quick story. So in 1860, when Lincoln is nominated to be the Republican, nominee for president, most of the East Coast political know-it-alls, they just said, this is just some hick from the sticks. He can't string two, proper English sentences together, all this kind of stuff. And this kingmaker, Thurlow Weed of the Republican Party, a New Yorker, goes out to Springfield. He meets with Lincoln and says, this is not some redneck. This guy is a political genius. And he realized that and became one of Lincoln's key, advisors. The idea that Lincoln was able to change essentially a war to save the Union into a war to end slavery is an absolute bit of political genius. He certainly was going to have his hands full, but I have no idea. But I think we can't sell short the possibility that he might have found a way to have Reconstruction work better, to have it more long lasting.
Yeah, there's plenty of good checks on his resume to show that he was capable of great things.
Absolutely. No, he's an incredible, as all your listeners know,
Yeah.
He was an absolutely incredible person. One thing I tried to do in the book is also to humanize him. And so we don't just have this stone figure up
Pantheon,
there.
yeah.
I tried to talk about him as a father, particularly to young Tad, get a sense of his physical ailments. And for us to remember that not only did the country, the loyal citizens of America lose their president, but, a couple of sons lost their father, a wife lost their husband, and to put that into perspective as well.
All right, Scott, I'm going to finish with this question I always finish with when I speak to my authors. So if you had a bookcase that you've had your whole life, what two books would I definitely find on that bookshelf? And doesn't have to be history because it's from when you were little.
I would certainly, even though it has some issues, I think that there's no question that Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the greatest novels ever written. Her black characters are not very good because she didn't understand them because she was a victim of Jim Crow as well. But that's a book that you can just open any page to and just be blown away by. There are lots of nonfiction books, but I'm a great Dickens fan. I mean, Dickens was Just who's topped him? I mean, in terms of understanding people, I could easily stick David Copperfield or Great Expectations there. Those are two absolutely marvelous books.
That's
But boy,
awesome.
I can give you another 100 easily.
Do you find yourself reading more fiction or nonfiction when you have the time to read? Because being a historian is kind of rough finding
I
time.
read both. I do read a lot of fiction, and to get to use all of my books are nonfiction. I don't make up anything, but I certainly novelists know how to tell stories, and good novelists do. And I try to study and understand their techniques to help us engage the reader. Someone, I don't know whether this was Ken Follett or Stephen King, said about, in this case, a thriller, that the first section of a thriller has to pose a question that the reader absolutely has to have answered. And I thought, boy, that's just brilliant. And I've tried to do that and to try to set it up that the reader really wants to find out, how does this thing end? What's going to happen? And so I salute fiction writers and love their stuff.
Scott, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and kind of what you're up to next?
Well, so I just finally, after after putting it off for years and years, I finally have an author website. It's called scottellsworthauthor.com. It turns out I also now have a Wikipedia page. You can look me up. There's another Scott Ellsworth. You have to kind of dig for me, but you can find me. My books are all out on Amazon, and I'm easily reached. You can track me down at the University of Michigan, but you can also find me through how to write me through my website. But here's the deal: I love hearing from readers. And here's the other special deal, which is I don't know what I'm writing next. So I'm searching for my next book. So I would love to hear suggestions from folks out there. But I do hope you all, enjoy Midnight on the Potomac. It was an honor to write the book and an honor to write about this crucial period in our past, one that teaches a lot about today.
Scott, thank you so much for taking the time. This was a great conversation.
Thanks, Peter.